before I go to you, I think it might be useful to senators on the committee and others observing this process to understand that your former role was as the National Director before you moved to Canberra, Goulburn, and I'll ask you another question related to that area in a moment. But would you care to add to Mrs Cronin's comments first?
Yes, so there have been recently some claims that Catholic education is somehow squirreling money from disadvantaged schools towards advantaged schools. So we acknowledge that the needs of students in schools, and we have more than 1,700 across Australia, is complicated. I spend a lot of time with parents in my role as Director of Catholic Education, and I haven't met a parent who thinks their child is average, and we have to meet the needs of every child. And so it can be difficult for people to understand the needs-based funding distribution. And what our analysis has found that we're releasing today is that our most disadvantaged schools, less than average, on the measure that's used consistently across all schools, that's the Index of Community Socio-Educational Advantage, ICSEA, it's on my school. If we compare the disadvantaged schools with advantaged schools, we're putting per student government funding into those schools more than 50% higher than the advantaged schools. So we think the evidence is really clear, and we assume that the Education Department has access to the same data set. It's publicly available My School data to show that actually we are directing significant government funding to disadvantaged students in Catholic schools, and we're actually quite proud of that. That's the purpose and intent of Catholic education. And when we compared the same approach to distributing government funding in government schools, we found that the discrepancy between disadvantaged and advantaged wasn't as significant as what we were doing. And I think it's easy to find, because of the complexity of school funding, individual school examples that ask questions, and we would caution against that. I'm sure my colleagues could speak to the fact that every year after we determine our funding distribution, we get individual school communities write in and say, actually, we've had some local issue and we need further system support. And with the system, we're able to provide that. And it might be a large number of teachers on sick leave. It might be some family tragedy. It might be a lot of teachers on maternity leave. So there's very significant issues which drive cost of education in individual schools. So it can be quite misleading to look at funding comparing a single school with another. So we've looked at overall Catholic education nationally, and we've seen a result that endorses the needs-based funding distribution that we've got, and it's going towards disadvantaged schools and students in Catholic education in a very significant way.
So, Mr Fox, you might have heard my earlier discussion with independent schools about the design of the capacity to contribute arrangements. And so I mentioned earlier, because you were with the NCEC at the time when those arrangements were designed, I would argue consistent with how the Gonski Review recommended that process should occur. Others now are attempting to claim that's not the case. My concern with the redesign, and I'd like you to comment on this, is that the original design that the Gonski Review recommended was very mindful of two factors. One is that Catholic primary school education was, according to Grattan at the time and their reports to various state governments, producing high or very good outcomes, and that we didn't want to introduce a formula that was going to compromise those outcomes. And so the capacity to contribute arrangements were tested across the Catholic education systems as a whole to see what problems might eventuate. And the ultimate design of that curve was to ensure, as Gonski recommended, that Catholic education could continue to deliver low-fee, accessible primary school education into the future. Is there anything further to that you'd like to add?
Can I just offer a couple of reflections? So there's been a lot of focus on the ACT, which actually under this plan over 10 years gets less money than it does today. And there's been a claim that ACT Catholic schools are somehow unique and different from the rest of the country. From my national knowledge in my former role, what I know is that there's very similar Catholic low-fee inclusive primary schools, like the ACT, if you go to Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth. They're actually there, and you can see their characteristics, and the funding levels that the Australian government provides to ACT schools, Catholic schools, are not that dissimilar to what's going on in those low-fee inclusive schools. And just a couple of points following on from that commentary. The reality is that the original schooling resource standard, it was actually calculated with a disproportionate number of Catholic schools in the sample. So we actually, because we're relatively high performing for the government investment that's made in Catholic schools, and we strive to be low fee, affordable and inclusive, but we're quite high performing in many instances on NAPLAN tests, which was the raw measure, and we wouldn't say that's great, but it's a raw measure they use. So we were disproportionately represented. And then when the Australian Education Act was passed, there was quite a significant focus on Catholic primary schools. It happens that Catholic education has 90% of standalone non-government primary schools in Australia. They've been built up over more than 150 years on a tradition of being low-fee, inclusive, serving a local community, and just like a government school, and very much in parallel with that. And so what this model has done is increase the expected fee for every primary school student in a non-government school in Australia, and it's particularly increasing expected fees in Catholic primary schools right across Australian communities. And so last week the government, so I understand the Department of Education's submission to this committee made clear that the government had implemented a funding freeze for a few years before the funding decline starts for ACT Catholic schools. That's an admission the model doesn't work for all schools, particularly low-fee inclusive Catholic primary schools, and you can actually see those schools in other jurisdictions, albeit that the effect of the model is smoothed over, is hidden because they're such big systems. And so this model is treating those low-fee Catholic primary schools in a very adverse way. They've made arbitrary changes through this process which result in much higher fee expectations. I think hopefully I've covered the points you've raised.
Well, you have, and you also covered an additional point, which was, these growth figures that the government's provided over the forwards and over 10 years, where they nationalised the figures across all education sectors, conceal a range of issues and problems with the model.
And I'm in a bit of a unique situation. I have 29 schools in the ACT. I also have 27 schools in New South Wales. So I operate across two jurisdictions. And what I know is the minister's written to every one of those schools. And in New South Wales, with a couple of exceptions, there's the promise of significant funding growth. But we now know that if the schools are to realise that funding growth, New South Wales Catholic education will need to cut funding, sometimes very dramatically, to schools across New South Wales and particularly in Sydney. And that is pitting school against school. So we've got local members in New South Wales informed by the minister that funding would increase, but not telling them where the funding's got to come from, and it's got to come from some other electorate in some other part of New South Wales. And this is quite serious because it's confusing school communities. It's setting expectations that can't be delivered if the minister thinks that we don't need to increase fees or we don't need to close schools.
Mr.